Welcome! Today we are going to talk about quadratic equations. My name is Blake Morris and I'm with the Tutoring Solution. What is a quadratic equation? And more particularly, what makes a quadratic equation a quadratic equation? If you're looking at some random equation and it's 5x squared minus 2x plus 4 is equal to 0. Let's say it's that. Okay, so when we look at this equation, we instantly know that it's a quadratic. The reason that we know it's a quadratic is because of this little guy right here, the 2. Okay, so for an equation to be a quadratic, it has to be to the degree of 2. Okay, so looking at this equation, we can see that this one is obviously 1, and then there's nothing over here, so it's 0. So the highest number we have is this one right here, the 2. So instantly we know that this is a quadratic equation. Now, for instance, let's say that there's 5x plus 3x squared plus 2 is equal to 5. Okay, looking at this one, once again, we see we have a 1 here, we have a 0, x to the 0 here, and we have a 2 here. Once again, this is good. This is a quadratic equation. Okay, so now we know what quadratic equations are. So if you guys ever come to a quadratic equation and are trying to solve it, the first thing you need to look for is the 2. If you find that 2, then you can use one of the methods we're going to talk about to solve it. The first thing we want to talk about when talking about quadratic equations is standard form. Now, before you get all confused, it's simple. Standard form is really easy, but while it may be really easy, it's extremely important when we talk about solving quadratic equations. Let me show you what standard form is first, and then we'll talk about it. So ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. This is standard form. Okay, now what comes into account and is very, very important is this one, and this one. Okay, so when you use the quadratic formula, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you're going to be relating to A, B, and C. And if you don't know what those are, you're not going to be able to use the quadratic formula, and you're going to potentially have a nightmare of a time solving a quadratic equation. And always, always, always put your equations in this form. You guys will have a nightmare of a time solving the problem if you don't put it in this form originally. I'm serious. It's very, very difficult. Alright, now that we've got standard form down, we're going to move on to actually solving a quadratic equation. Here we are, and the first method we're going to talk about when solving a quadratic equation is by factoring. Now, personally, this is my favorite, and it should be your favorite. It's by far the simplest way to solve any quadratic equation. Alright, so let's look at this problem right here. Okay, instantly we can see something forming up right away. Okay, first thing we have to do though is we have to check to make sure it's a quadratic equation. If this problem isn't a quadratic equation, then we can't use factoring, and therefore we're going to have to solve this equation using some other method. Remember that there has to be a 2. If there's a 2, then you're good to go. And look at that. There is a 2. That means that this is a quadratic equation, and we can use factoring to solve it. Alright, so in this one, the first thing to look for is a common factor. It's the easiest way of factoring. Alright, so if we look at both of them, this one's got a 3, and this one's got a 3, but this one also has an x, and this one has an x. So we simply can pull 3x out here, and we get an x plus 1 on the inside. It's that easy. Now, these are two separate entities, and we therefore know that 3x is equal to 0, and x plus 1 is equal to 0. Now, we can solve this one first, and we literally just divide both sides by 3, and 0 divided by 3 is still 0. And we can subtract 1 from this equation, and x is equal to -1. And look at that. There are your answers. And something I forgot to mention a little bit earlier, but you will always have two answers for a quadratic equation. And the reason being is if you look at this, degree, the 2, if you look at this 2 right here, it tells you how many answers there are going to be. So, for a quadratic equation, there's always two answers. Now, if you were to look at a little bit of a different equation, I'm going to write this in the bottom left corner. 3x cubed plus 1 is equal to 0. Now, while this problem is not a quadratic, we know how many answers there will be due to this little guy right here. There's going to be 3 answers. It's very simple. Whatever the degree is of your equation, that's how many answers you're going to have. Looking back, that was the most basic type of factoring for a quadratic equation. Let's look at something a little bit more complicated, but in terms of solving a quadratic equation, very simple. Alright, so let's look at this problem right here. X squared minus 3x minus 10 is equal to 0. Alright, now I told you the first thing to look for is something in common in each of them. Alright, so if we look at this first one, it's got an x, and we look at this one, it's got an x, but unfortunately, this one does not have an x. So, common factors, there are 0. But there's a different way we can factor it. If you guys remember FOIL would be the best way to factor it. So you have an x here and an x here. If you look, x times x is x squared. So these two are equal to this little guy right here. Okay? And we see that there is a negative sign here and a negative sign here. So we instantly know that it has to be a plus and a minus. Okay? Remember, two negatives, always a plus and minus. Okay, now we need to look at our last piece. This one right here. What do you multiply to get to 10 that's equal to 3? Well, the first thing that pops into my head is a 5 and a 2. Now, since it's a -3, it's a -3 here, it needs to be a larger negative value. So 5 times 2, we put the large value here, which is -5, and there we go. This times this should equal that. It's that simple. So all that's equal to 0, don't forget that. And just like in the last problem, now that we have two separate pieces, we got this one and we got this one, we can set both of them equal to 0. So we have x plus 2 is equal to 0, and we have x minus 5 is equal to 0. Now we can solve them very simple. X is equal to -2. Simply subtract the positive 2 on both sides. And this one is easy as well. Just add 5 to both sides. And x is equal to -2, and x is equal to 5. And that is your answer. There's one more type of problem you might see, and it would be very good for you guys to know. Okay, so it's a very simple type of problem, and if you see it, you instantly will know how to solve it. Let's take a look at this. X squared minus 64 is equal to 0. Now, I'm also going to write another problem for you guys. Alright, x squared minus 16 is equal to 0. Okay, and I'm also going to write another one. X squared minus 4 is equal to 0. Now, as you can see, I haven't left very much space, and that's because these problems are very, very simple. But, as you can see, they are still quadratics. They all have a degree of 2, so you need to treat them like quadratics. Alright, so when we look at this problem, we instantly can factor it, and it's the easiest factoring you've ever done. Alright, so once again, look at this. So you got x here, and let's see, down here, x, lots of x's. Alright, now, what do you guys see in common with all three of these problems? Well, they all have an x squared. You're right about that, but they also have something else in common. Oh, you got it again. They all have a negative. And they also have something else in common, but it's a little bit trickier to see. Alright, what I want you guys to look at is the 64, the 16, and the 4. These are all squares, okay? So, if you look at the first one, what do you multiply times each other? The same number, you get 64. Yeah, you guys got it. It's 8, okay? And this problem is really easy to factor because simply you put a plus and a minus. So you put a plus and a minus, and then you put the square root of this value right here. And that is your answer. So it's going to be plus 8, and it's going to be minus 8. And then you'd solve, and you'd basically get x is equal to negative 8, and x is equal to 8. And you guys, if you guys ever see this problem, you can almost solve it in your head. That's how simple it is. All right, so let's look at number 2 here, and let's see. So we know that it's a 4 here and a 4 here, because like I said, take the square root, and it's always a plus and a minus. And your answers are x is equal to negative 4, and x is equal to 4. Now let's look at the bottom one here. Okay. So, once again, plus and minus, and then take the square root of that 4, and it's 2 and 2. Your answer is x is equal to negative 2, and x is equal to 2. Moving on now from factoring, the next step to solve a quadratic equation if factoring does not work. Let's tackle completing the square. Alright, so let's look at this problem, for example. X squared plus 6x minus 7 is equal to 0. Alright, so you look at that, and instantly you go, okay, we got a 2, therefore it's a quadratic equation. Let's see if you can do it with factoring. Now, let's see, we got x here, so you got a plus here and a minus here, so it's going to be plus and a minus. And let's see, a 7 and a 1, because 7 times 1 is equal to that guy. So, and we know that it has to be 7 over here and 1 over here. So this is equal to 0, so x is equal to positive 1, and x is equal to negative 7. Alright, well, in this case, it did work out. We were able to factor it. But what happens if you can't factor it? Well, we have our answers here, so let's do it by completing the squares and see if we can somehow get back to those answers. Alright, so let's rewrite the little guy over here. X squared plus 6x minus 7 is equal to 0. So the first step when doing a quadratic equations by completing the squares is to move your loose number over to this side. Okay, so this is step numero uno. Okay, so you got x squared plus 6x, and like I said, move it. Alright, so it's equal to plus 7, right? You add 7 to both sides. So you have x squared plus 6x is equal to positive 7. Okay, so this is where it gets tricky. This is where the completing the square comes into play. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to take this number right here. Okay, you are going to divide that number by 2, and you're going to square it. So 6 over 2 squared is equal to 9. You agree? That's all you got to do. And what you do with that number is you add it to both sides of your equation. Okay, so x squared plus 6x plus 9 is equal to 7 plus 9. Alright, so that was it. That's all you got to do. You take this number right here, you divide it by 2, you square it, and you add it to both sides. Alright, now that you've added that to both sides, simplify over here. So you have 16 is equal to x squared plus 6x plus 9. Now that you have that, we can easily factor the left side of the equation. So we know that the left side is going to be x plus 3 squared. You guys got it. That's the easy part. Is equal to 16. Well, let's run this over here. I don't want to crowd. So if we take the square root of both sides, so we take the square root of x plus 3 squared is equal to the square root of 16. We're going to get positive negative 4, and we're going to get x plus 3. And there is almost the answer. The only thing you have left to do is is subtract that 3 from both sides. So first you have the 4 minus 3, and then you have the x is equal to negative 4 minus 3. Don't forget that sign, guys. So the top one is going to be 1, and the bottom one is going to be negative 7. So let's take a look at this problem. Now, looking at it right away, I know that we can solve it using factoring. We can use the quadratic factoring, but I don't want to do that. I instead want to go the alternate route and solve by completing the square. First thing you do, always, remember what I told you guys. Move this guy over to this side. We're going to simply add 5 to both sides. So now you got x squared plus 4x is equal to 5. Now, remember what I told you. You take this number, you take it over here, you divide it by 2, and you square it, which is 4. Alright, then you take that number, you take this little guy right here, and you add him to both sides. Do not forget that. Alright, so you got x squared plus 4x plus 4 is equal to 5 plus 4, or 9. X plus 2 squared, remember, this factors to a square. Always remember that. Whenever you complete the square, this one right here will factor to a square, okay? Then we add the other side up, and we get 9. Then, oh, look at that. It's amazing. We can take the square root of both sides, and we get a positive negative 3 on the right, and on the left we get x plus 2. Simply then, we go x is equal to negative 2 plus 3, and x is equal to negative 2 minus 3. And that is going to be equal to 1, and that is going to be equal to negative 5. And just like that, you guys have the answer. And honestly, I think completing squares is pretty easy when you compare it to quadratic formula. Though it is a little bit more complicated than factoring, I give you that. But this is definitely the second method to go if factoring doesn't work. We're on to our final method for solving quadratic equations. By far my least favorite, but sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes factoring and completing the square both fail, and that's okay. This big, long, horrible looking equation is the quadratic formula. But it's actually not too bad when you start to break it down. Now, remember earlier I told you this, ax squared plus bx plus c. Remember that? That is standard form. And that's where the a, b, and c become very important. You have to remember a, b, and c so that you can put those numbers into the spots in our big equation. Let's dive into a problem. Let's tackle this bad boy head on. Alright, so we have this quadratic right here, x squared minus 4x minus 8 is equal to 0. Okay, so let's look at that. And honestly, right off the bat, I don't see anything that we can factor. Completing the square probably is not going to work. Let's do it with quadratic formula. Okay, so let's look at the first part. And we know that we have an imaginary 1 there. We have a 4 here, and we have an 8 here. And remember, it's negative 4 and negative 8. On the side here, what we're going to do is we're going to write a is equal to 1, b is equal to negative 4, and c is equal to negative 8. Remember those, because the quadratic formula needs each and every one of them. Alright, so let's jump into the quadratic formula. I'm going to do it in blue so you guys see what the equation looks like. X is equal to, so negative b, so a negative and a negative 4 cancel out, so it becomes 4. Then you got plus or minus. Okay, and let's pause real quick here. Plus and minus. So I told you guys earlier that every quadratic formula has 2 answers. Every quadratic equation you're going to do. So what dictates that part is this. You have your 2 answers, and the reason you're going to get those 2 answers is because of that plus and minus. No other way. So that plus and minus is very important. Don't forget it. Alright, let's go back to the quadratic equation and let's hop into this. Alright, so b squared, so negative 4 times negative 4, or negative 4 squared, is 16 positive, don't forget that. Then you have negative 4 ac, so a is 1 and c is negative 8. Okay, now we just have the bottom part of the equation, and you have 2 times 1. Oh, that's lovely. You just have 2 there now. All right, so now let's do some simplifying. X is equal to 4 plus or minus, and then we have 16 minus, or now it's going to become plus because you have a negative 4 times a negative 8, which is a positive 32. And then it's all over 2. Alright, so let's simplify a little bit further. So x is equal to 4 plus or minus. Alright, and now let's do a little bit of math in our head. I know you guys can do this. You guys are definitely the level of math you can do math in your head. Alright, so 16 plus 32 is 48, okay? Now 48 is 3 times 16, and the square root of 16 is 4, and then left in there is 3, and then you got 2 right there. Alright, and now very simply, cancel out that 2, and what you'll get is 2 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3, and if you're going, hey, we don't have 2 answers. Yeah, we do. Are you kidding me? We got 2 answers. The reason we have 2 answers is in the orange here, plus and minus. You have a 2 plus 2 times the square root of 3, and you have a 2 minus 2 times the square root of 3. Alright, before we wrap up today, let's tackle one more using the quadratic formula. Now, you see this problem I wrote here. Now, I look at it, and I instantly see that we can factor it. But just for the sake of learning, let's do it using the quadratic formula. Over here on the side, remember, A is equal to 1, B is equal to 3, and C is equal to negative 4. Don't forget that. Alright, and now we're gonna do the quadratic formula in green. And always, always, always write out the quadratic formula before you do it. Alright, so this long equation, just write it out. Just write it out. It'll be worth it. It'll be worth it. Alright. And then on bottom, 2a. Simple. Alright, let's dive into it. So we got x is equal to, so b is a positive 3, so it becomes negative 3 because of the equation. You got plus or minus. Remember, plus and minus dictates the 2 answers. B squared is 3 times 3, which is 9, minus 4 times 1 times c, which is negative 4. Alright, and then on bottom is 2 times 1, which, come on guys, you can do that. It's just 2. Alright, now, so we have x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus, so on the inside it's 9, and then negative 4 times a negative 4 is 16, times a 1 is 16, so you have 9 plus 16, which, don't you guys love that? Because look, we get negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 25 over 2, and so now, on top we have negative 3 plus 5 over 2, and look over here, we have negative 3 minus 5 over 2. And this is going to give you your 2 values. So let's see. So we'll take this one over here. So negative 3 plus a negative 5 is negative 8. 2 goes into negative 8, negative 4 times. And this one over here is negative 3 plus 5 is 2, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So your answers are negative 4, that's a horrible 4, and 1. So, brief recap. What makes a quadratic? Well, you tell me. It's simple. It's just if it's raised to the degree of 2. If you have an equation and it's raised to the degree of 2, it's a quadratic, and by all means, put that quadratic in standard form, which is my second recap point, and you guys know what it is. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, and once it's in standard form, dive straight into solving it. First method I tried, be factoring. Look for a common factor first, obviously. If there's no common factor, try by FOIL. Hopefully FOIL works for you. It generally works most of the time, especially in textbooks. They make it nice and easy for you guys. If factoring doesn't work, try completing the square. Remember, take the middle term, divide it by 2, square it, and add it to both sides. It's very simple. Just practice that in your head before a test, and you guys will knock out the test. And finally, try the quadratic formula, which, like I said before, it is no good, but it does work. It sucks to do, but you guys got to do it sometimes. I've been Blake Morris. I was with Tutoring Solution, obviously, and I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day.